When my husband's family invited us to dinner with investors, his mother didn't expect my question. The crystal chandelier cast dancing shadows across the mahogany dining table as I smoothed down my navy dress for the third time in 5 minutes. My palms were damp, and I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird desperate to escape. "You'll be fine, honey," Marcus whispered, his hand finding mine as we stood outside his parents' imposing colonial mansion. "Just maybe don't mention the community college thing tonight, okay?" The words stung, even though I knew he meant well. 3 years of marriage, and I was still the girl from the wrong side of town who'd somehow managed to snag their golden boy, the girl who'd worked 2 jobs to put herself through school while Marcus had his MBA handed to him on a silver platter. The heavy oak door swung open before Marcus could knock, revealing his mother, Patricia Whitmore, in all her perfectly coiffed glory. Her smile was razor sharp, the kind that could cut glass, and probably had on more than one occasion. "Marcus, darling." She pulled him into an embrace that somehow managed to exclude me entirely, despite my standing right next to him. "And Jessica," her name dropping from her lips like something distasteful she'd accidentally swallowed. "Mrs. Whitmore," I managed, forcing my own smile. "Thank you for having us." "Well, Robert insisted." Her pale blue eyes swept over me, cataloging every perceived flaw with the efficiency of a quality control inspector. "I do hope you understand how important tonight is. The Hendersons are considering a substantial investment in our expansion project." Our. Never Marcus's company, never the family business, always our, as if I were some outsider looking in through frosted glass. The foyer was exactly as I remembered from my handful of previous visits, all marble floors and oil paintings of stern-faced Whitmore ancestors who seemed to glare down at me with the same disapproval I'd grown accustomed to from their living descendants. The house smelled like old money and furniture polish, with an underlying note of something I could never quite identify, but always made me feel slightly nauseous. "The Hendersons should be arriving any moment," Patricia continued, leading us toward the formal dining room. "I trust you'll remember what we discussed about keeping conversation light and pleasant. Business matters can be so complicated for those not familiar with the intricacies involved." Translation: smile, look pretty, and for the love of all that's holy, don't embarrass us. Marcus squeezed my hand again, and I could feel his tension matching my own. He'd been on edge all week about this dinner, alternating between excitement about the potential investment and worry about how his family would treat me. Not that he'd ever admit the latter out loud. Robert Whitmore appeared from what I assumed was his study, a crystal tumbler of what looked like expensive whiskey in his hand despite the early hour. He was an older version of Marcus. Same strong jawline, same piercing green eyes, same way of looking through people rather than at them. "There's my boy," his voice boomed across the room as he approached. "Ready for the big night?" "As ready as I'll ever be, Dad." Marcus's voice carried a note I'd learned to recognize over the years, the desperate need for approval that he'd never quite outgrown, no matter how successful he became. "And Jessica?" Robert's acknowledgement was warmer than his wife's, but still carried that subtle undertone that reminded me I was a guest in their world, not a member of their family. Before I could respond, the doorbell chimed with the deep, resonant sound of expensive brass. Patricia immediately straightened, her society mask sliding into place with practiced ease. "That'll be the Hendersons," she announced unnecessarily. "Remember, everyone, this could be the deal that takes Whitmore Industries to the next level." The next few minutes passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Charles Henderson was exactly what I'd expected from Marcus's description. Tall, silver-haired, with the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about money. His wife, Victoria, was a study in understated elegance, wearing what I was certain was a designer dress that cost more than I made in 3 months at my marketing job. As we moved to the dining room, I found myself seated between Victoria and Marcus, directly across from Charles. Patricia had orchestrated the seating arrangement with military precision, ensuring that the important people could conduct their business while I was strategically positioned to contribute nothing more meaningful than compliments on the wine selection. The meal began with all the pomp and circumstance I'd come to expect from the Whitmores. Crystal glasses, multiple forks, and enough courses to feed a small village. The conversation flowed around me like water around a stone, touching on golf handicaps, mutual acquaintances, and the general state of the market. The expansion into the Pacific Northwest has been on our radar for months, Robert was saying, gesturing with his fork as he spoke. The lumber industry up there is ripe for disruption, and with our logistics expertise, we could corner that market within 5 years. Charles nodded thoughtfully. The initial investment requirements are substantial, though. We're talking about building 3 new distribution centers from the ground up, not to mention the staffing and equipment costs. The projections show a return on investment within 18 months, Marcus chimed in, and I could hear the eagerness in his voice. This was his baby, the project he'd been working on for the better part of 2 years. Projections are one thing, Victoria said delicately, but market conditions can be so unpredictable, especially in industries we're not familiar with. I watched the conversation unfold, noting the subtle power dynamics at play. Charles was interested but cautious, Victoria was the voice of skepticism, and the Whitmore men were trying desperately to close the deal without appearing desperate. Patricia, meanwhile, played the perfect hostess, ensuring glasses stayed full and conversations flowed smoothly. It was fascinating, really, like watching a chess match where everyone thought they were playing the same game, but were actually operating by completely different rules. Of course, the key is understanding the local market dynamics. We've done extensive research on the regulatory environment, the competition, the supply chain logistics. Research is crucial, agreed Charles, but sometimes the most valuable insights come from understanding the human element, the relationships, the unspoken agreements, the way business really gets done at the ground level. Something in his tone caught my attention. There was a weight to his words that suggested he wasn't just making casual conversation. Absolutely, Patricia jumped in smoothly. That's why we've been so thorough in our due diligence process. We understand that successful business relationships are built on trust and mutual understanding. Victoria smiled politely, but I caught something in her expression, a flicker of what? Skepticism, amusement. It was gone too quickly for me to be sure. The conversation continued along predictable lines. Marcus outlined the expansion timeline, Robert discussed the financial projections, and Charles asked pointed questions about market share and competitive advantages. I found myself studying the interplay between them, the way information was shared and withheld, the subtle tests and evaluations happening beneath the surface of polite dinner conversation. It reminded me of my thesis project from business school, the one I'd written about strategic decision-making in family-owned enterprises. I'd spent months researching how established family businesses navigated expansion opportunities, particularly when partnering with outside investors. The patterns were remarkably consistent across industries and regions. The real challenge, Charles was saying, is ensuring that expansion doesn't dilute the core brand identity that made the company successful in the first place. Exactly, Robert nodded vigorously. That's why we're being so selective about potential partners. We need investors who understand our values, our commitment to quality, our long-term vision. Victoria set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. And what would you say distinguishes Whitmore Industries from other logistics companies looking to expand into the same market? The question hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigar. It wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't particularly friendly either. Marcus shifted beside me, and I could sense his growing nervousness. Well, Robert began, but Charles held up a subtle hand. Actually, I'd be curious to hear the younger generation's perspective on this. Sometimes fresh eyes see opportunities that experience might overlook. The statement was polite enough, but I recognized it for what it was, a test. Not just for Marcus, but for the family as a whole. How would they handle having their business acumen questioned by someone outside their inner circle? Marcus launched into what I recognized as his standard pitch about innovative supply chain management and customer service excellence. It was good, professional, hitting all the right notes, but something about Charles's expression told me it wasn't quite hitting the mark. Patricia was watching the exchange with hawk-like intensity, clearly calculating how to steer the conversation back into safer waters. Robert was nodding along with Marcus, but I could see the slight tension around his eyes that suggested the evening wasn't going exactly as he'd planned. "Those are all important factors," Victoria said when Marcus finished, "but I have to ask, how do you plan to compete with companies that have existing relationships in those markets? Relationships that might go back decades?" The question was like a scalpel, precise and cutting. Marcus's confident smile faltered slightly, and I could practically hear Patricia's mental calculations accelerating. Relationships are important, but so is innovation. We're not trying to replicate what's already being done, we're trying to do it better. "Better how?" Charles asked, and now there was no mistaking the challenge in his voice. The silence stretched just a beat too long. Marcus glanced at his father, who cleared his throat, and began outlining their competitive advantages. But I could sense the momentum shifting. The Hendersons weren't just potential investors anymore, they were judges, and the Whitmores were failing their audition. I found myself studying Charles's face, trying to read the subtext behind his questions. There was something specific he was looking for, some particular insight or understanding that the Whitmore men weren't providing. But what? Then Victoria asked a question that made everything click into place. "Have you given any thought to the environmental impact of your expansion plans? The Pacific Northwest communities tend to be quite environmentally conscious, and that could affect both regulatory approval and community acceptance." It was a softball question, the kind any competent business plan should address easily. But Marcus's hesitation told me everything I needed to know. They'd focused so intently on the financial projections and logistics that they'd overlooked the political and social landscape they'd be entering. "Environmental considerations are certainly part of our planning process," Robert said carefully, but I could tell he was improvising. Charles and Victoria exchanged a look that spoke volumes. They weren't just unimpressed, they were actively concerned about the Whitmores' level of preparation. I felt something shift inside me, a familiar sensation I remembered from my college debate team days. The moment when you spotted the flaw in your opponent's argument and knew exactly how to exploit it. But this wasn't a debate. This was my husband's future, his family's business, and my chance to finally prove that I belonged at this table. The question was, did I dare speak up? Patricia was launching into damage control mode, steering the conversation towards safer topics like the excellent wine selection and the beautiful weather we'd been having. Marcus looked like he wanted to disappear into his chair. Robert was maintaining his poker face, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes. I said quietly, and the words seemed to surprise everyone at the table, including myself. "I spent some time in Oregon a few years ago, working on a project for my master's program." The conversation stopped dead. Every eye at the table turned to me, and I could feel Patricia's panic like a physical presence in the room. "That's nice, dear," she said quickly, clearly hoping to redirect the conversation before I could embarrass them further. But Charles held up a hand. "What kind of project?" I was researching sustainable supply chain practices in the lumber industry. Specifically, how companies were adapting to new environmental regulations and community expectations. Victoria leaned forward slightly, her interest clearly piqued. "And what did you find?" I glanced at Marcus, who was staring at me with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pride. Patricia looked like she was about to have a stroke. The companies that were thriving weren't the ones with the biggest marketing budgets or the most established relationships. They were the ones that understood that environmental responsibility wasn't just a regulatory requirement, it was a competitive advantage. "How so?" Charles asked, and now he was giving me his full attention. "Community buy-in," I explained. "The Pacific Northwest communities don't just tolerate businesses that operate in their backyard, they actively partner with companies they trust. But that trust has to be earned, and it has to be authentic. I could feel the energy in the room shifting. Victoria was nodding slightly, Charles was listening intently, and even Robert seemed to be reconsidering his earlier dismissal. The most successful expansion I studied was a company that built their entire Northwest strategy around environmental partnership. They didn't just meet environmental standards, they exceeded them. They hired locally, they partnered with environmental groups, they made their supply chain so transparent that communities actually celebrated their arrival. Interesting, Charles mused. And how did that affect their bottom line? Their costs were initially higher, I admitted, but their regulatory approval process was expedited, their community relations were seamless, and their employee retention was significantly better than the industry average. Within 3 years, they were the preferred logistics partner for every major manufacturer in the region. The silence that followed was different from the earlier uncomfortable pauses. This was the silence of people processing new information, recalculating their assumptions. You said this was for your master's program, Victoria asked. MBA. My thesis was on strategic decision-making in family-owned enterprises, with a focus on expansion into politically sensitive markets. Patricia looked like she'd swallowed her tongue. Marcus was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time. Robert was leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. But Charles was smiling. And what would you recommend for a company like Whitmore Industries looking to expand into that market? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could feel Patricia's silent desperation, Robert's cautious interest, and Marcus's barely contained anxiety. But more than that, I could feel my moment of truth arriving. I'd recommend a complete strategic pivot. And the words came out steady and sure. Instead of trying to compete on efficiency and cost, compete on partnership and sustainability. Make environmental responsibility your core differentiator. That sounds expensive, Robert interjected. It is, I agree, initially, but the long-term benefits far outweigh the upfront investment, especially if you're looking at a 5-year timeline. Charles was nodding thoughtfully. You mentioned transparency. What would that look like in practical terms? I found myself settling into the familiar rhythm of strategic analysis, the mental processes I'd honed through years of case studies and business planning exercises. Complete supply chain visibility, I explained. Public reporting on environmental metrics, community advisory boards with actual decision-making power, partnership agreements with local environmental groups, maybe even a profit-sharing arrangement with the communities where you operate. Profit sharing? Robert's voice carried a note of skepticism. It sounds radical, I admitted, but it creates the kind of stakeholder alignment that makes expansion sustainable. Communities stop seeing you as an external threat and start seeing you as a local partner. Victoria was taking notes now, actually taking notes on my suggestions. The other advantage, I continued, gaining momentum, is that it creates barriers to entry for competitors. Once you've established those community relationships, it becomes much harder for other companies to replicate your success. Because trust can't be bought, Charles said. And there was something in his voice that suggested I'd finally hit the mark he'd been looking for. Exactly. It has to be earned. And it takes time to build. But once you have it, it's incredibly valuable. The conversation that followed was unlike anything I'd experienced at a Whitmore family gathering. Instead of polite small talk and careful social navigation, we dove deep into strategic planning, market analysis, and implementation timelines. Charles and Victoria asked pointed questions about regulatory frameworks, community engagement strategies, and competitive positioning. And for the first time since I'd married into this family, I was an active participant rather than a silent observer. Marcus joined in enthusiastically, building on my suggestions with his own insights about operational logistics. Robert, once he got over his initial surprise, proved to have a shrewd understanding of the political landscape. Even Patricia, though clearly struggling to process this new dynamic, contributed useful observations about stakeholder management. The key question, he said as we moved toward dessert, is whether Whitmore Industries is truly committed to this kind of strategic transformation. It's not just about adding some environmental initiatives to your existing business plan. It's about fundamentally changing how you operate. Change can be challenging, especially for a family business with established ways of doing things. But necessary, I added quietly. The companies that survive and thrive are the ones that evolve with their markets. Charles looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each of us in turn. I have to say, this conversation has been far more enlightening than I expected when we arrived tonight. Victoria smiled, and for the first time all evening, it seemed completely genuine. It's refreshing to see a company that values diverse perspectives. Too many family businesses get trapped in groupthink. Patricia's smile was strained, but she managed to maintain her hostess composure. We've always believed in the importance of different viewpoints. The lie was so transparent that I almost laughed, but I caught myself just in time. As the evening wound down, Charles and Victoria excused themselves for a private conversation, while Patricia bustled about clearing dishes and Robert disappeared into his study. Marcus and I found ourselves alone in the formal living room, surrounded by the portraits of his ancestors and the weight of everything that had just happened. "I can't believe you never told me about your master's thesis," he said finally. "You never asked," I replied, and tried to keep the hurt out of my voice. "I know, He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as his go-to move when he was processing difficult emotions. "I had no idea you knew so much about our industry." "There's a lot you don't know about me," I said softly, "because you've never been curious enough to ask." The words hung between us like a bridge we'd both been afraid to cross for 3 years. Marcus looked at me as if he was seeing me clearly for the first time, and I realized that maybe he was. The community college comment, earlier tonight. That hurt. His face flushed with embarrassment. "Jess, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. You were ashamed of me, of where I came from, how I got my education, what I've accomplished on my own." I took a breath, surprised by how calm I felt. "But you know what? I'm not ashamed of any of it. I worked 2 jobs to put myself through school. I earned every grade, every degree, every opportunity. And if your parents can't see value in that, then maybe the problem isn't with me." Before Marcus could respond, Charles and Victoria returned to the living room. Their expressions were unreadable, but there was an energy about them that suggested decisions had been made. "We've had a very productive discussion," Charles announced as Robert and Patricia joined us, "and we'd like to propose moving forward with the investment." The relief in the room was palpable. Robert's shoulders relaxed, Marcus broke into a genuine smile, and even Patricia managed to look pleased. However, Victoria continued, and the word landed like a small bomb. "We have one condition." The tension immediately snapped back into place. "We want Jessica to lead the community engagement and environmental partnership initiatives. Her insights tonight convinced us that she understands the market dynamics better than anyone else at this table." The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia looked like she'd been slapped. Robert's mouth was hanging slightly open. Marcus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I started, then stopped. "I have a job at Morrison Marketing. We're prepared to offer you a position as Director of Strategic Partnerships, with a substantial salary increase and equity participation in the expansion project." My mind was racing. 6 months ago, I'd been the outsider at family dinners, barely acknowledged and certainly never consulted. Now I was being offered a leadership role in the family business by the very investors the Whitmores had been desperate to impress. "This is unexpected," Robert managed. "Good business decisions often are," Charles replied. "Jessica demonstrated tonight that she has exactly the kind of strategic thinking and market insight we need for this project to succeed." Patricia cleared her throat delicately. "Of course, we're thrilled that Jessica's contributions have been so well received. We've always known she was a valuable member of our family. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its audacity, but I found I was too stunned to be angry about it. What do you say, Jessica? Are you interested in putting your research into practice? I looked around the room at the faces staring back at me. Patricia, struggling to process this complete upheaval of her carefully ordered world. Robert, calculating the business implications. Marcus, torn between pride and confusion. And I realized that for the first time since I'd walked into this house 3 years ago, I held all the cards. I'd like to discuss the details, the scope of the role, the reporting structure, the timeline for implementation. Of course, Charles nodded approvingly. Why don't you come to our office next week? We can outline the full proposal and answer any questions you might have. As the Hendersons prepared to leave, the social dynamics in the room had shifted so completely that it felt like we were all playing different characters in a play none of us had rehearsed. Well, Patricia said finally, her voice artificially bright. That was certainly interesting. Interesting is one word for it. Robert agreed. He looked at me with something that might have been respect, though it was hard to tell. I had no idea you had such extensive knowledge of our industry. There's a lot you don't know about me, Marcus said, and I heard something new in his voice, something that sounded almost like pride. Patricia's smile was razor sharp. Yes, well, it's wonderful when family members can contribute in unexpected ways. The passive aggression was so thick you could have cut it with a knife, but for once, I didn't feel hurt, because I finally understood something I'd been too insecure to see before. Patricia's disapproval wasn't really about me. It was about her own fear of losing control, of having her carefully constructed world challenged by forces she couldn't predict or manage. I should probably think about this opportunity carefully. It would be a significant career change. Of course, Robert agreed quickly. Take all the time you need. Though I have to say, having someone with your expertise leading our community engagement efforts could be exactly what we need to make this expansion successful. As Marcus and I drove home that night, the silence in the car was different from the tense quiet of our drive over. This was the silence of two people processing a seismic shift in their relationship and trying to figure out what it meant. I'm proud of you, Marcus said finally, as we pulled into our driveway. Are you? And I genuinely wasn't sure. Yes, God, Jess, you were incredible tonight. The way you handled Charles's questions, the insights you offered, the whole strategic framework you laid out, I had no idea you were capable of that level of business analysis, because you never bothered to find out. He was quiet for a moment. You're right. I've been seeing you as the person I married instead of the person you've become. And who do you think I've become? Someone much stronger and more capable than I gave you credit for. He turned to look at me in the dim light from our porch. The question is, what do you want to do about the Hendersons' offer? I stared up at our modest 2-bedroom house with its small front garden and the picket fence Marcus had installed himself last spring. It was a good life we'd built here, comfortable and predictable. But comfortable and predictable suddenly felt like a cage I'd been living in without realizing it. I think, I said slowly, that maybe it's time for both of us to see what I'm really capable of. The next morning, I called in sick to Morrison Marketing and spent the day researching everything I could find about the Henderson Group, their investment philosophy, and their track record with family-owned businesses. What I discovered was both reassuring and intimidating. They weren't just wealthy investors looking to park money in promising ventures. They were strategic partners who specialized in helping established companies navigate complex market transitions. Their portfolio included several family businesses that had successfully expanded into challenging markets, and their approach consistently emphasized long-term relationship building over short-term profit maximization. In other words, they were exactly the kind of partners who would value the strategic framework I'd outlined at dinner. But they were also the kind of partners who expected results. I spent the afternoon updating my resume and preparing for what I suspected would be an intensive interview process. If I was going to do this, I needed to be ready to prove that my insights at dinner weren't just lucky guesses or academic theorizing. That evening, with a bottle of wine and a slightly shell-shocked expression. "My mother called me at work today," he announced, setting the bottle on the kitchen counter. "Oh?" I tried to keep my voice neutral, but we both knew Patricia's post-dinner analysis was going to be memorable. She wanted to discuss the new dynamics in our family business. He made air quotes around the phrase, and I could hear Patricia's voice in the careful syllables. "And what did you tell her?" "That my wife is brilliant, and I'm sorry it took me 3 years to notice." He pulled me into his arms, and for the first time in months, it felt completely natural. Also, that if she has a problem with Jessica Whitmore leading the Community Engagement Initiative, she can take it up with the Henderson Group. "Jessica Whitmore?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow. "Well, you are a Whitmore now, whether my parents like it or not." He kissed my forehead. "The question is whether you want to be." It was a fair question. Taking the Henderson offer would mean diving headfirst into the family business, working closely with people who had dismissed and underestimated me for years, proving myself in an industry I'd only studied from the outside. But it would also mean finally having the chance to put my skills and knowledge to work on something that mattered. Instead of creating marketing campaigns for products I didn't care about, I'd be building partnerships and creating sustainable business practices that could genuinely improve communities. "I want to hear what they're offering," I said finally. "Full details, clear expectations, honest assessment of the challenges involved." And then I smiled, feeling a confidence I hadn't experienced in years. And then we'll see what Jessica Whitmore is really capable of. The meeting with the Henderson Group the following week was everything I'd expected and more. They didn't just offer me a job, they offered me the chance to design and implement an entirely new approach to corporate expansion. The salary was more than double what I was making at Morrison Marketing. The equity stake would make me a genuine partner in the venture's success. But more importantly, they gave me complete autonomy over the community engagement and environmental partnership initiatives. "We're not interested in micromanaging your approach," Charles explained as we sat in their elegantly appointed conference room. "How you build those community relationships is entirely up to you." "Within budget parameters, of course," Victoria added with a smile. "Of course. But I'd want to establish community advisory boards with real decision-making authority, not just advisory roles, but actual input into operational decisions that affect their regions. That's a significant level of stakeholder involvement," Charles noted. "Are you confident it won't create operational complications?" "I'm confident it will create operational advantages. Community stakeholders who have genuine input into business decisions become partners in the venture's success. They have skin in the game." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from regulatory strategy to environmental impact metrics, to employee recruitment and retention. By the end, I felt like I had been through the most intensive job interview of my life. But I also felt like I had found my calling. "We'd like to offer you the position," Victoria said as the meeting concluded, "Director of Strategic Partnerships, with the scope and authority we've discussed. I accept." And the words felt like stepping off a cliff into freefall. The transition from my marketing job to the family business was smoother than I'd expected, largely because the Henderson Group had provided detailed transition support and clear performance metrics. Within my first month, I'd established preliminary contact with environmental groups in 3 target communities and begun the regulatory research that would inform our expansion strategy. But the real test came at my first Whitmore Industries board meeting. The boardroom was exactly what I'd expected. Mahogany table, leather chairs, portraits of company founders staring down from the walls. Robert sat at the head of the table, with Marcus to his right and Patricia to his left. I was seated at the far end, nominally included but clearly positioned as the most junior member of the group. Our first agenda item is the Pacific Northwest Expansion Project. Jessica has been leading the community engagement initiatives, so I'll turn it over to her for an update. The tone was professional, but I caught the subtle skepticism in his voice. 3 months into the project, and they were still waiting to see whether the Henderson Group's faith in me was justified. I stood up, activated the presentation screen, and began outlining the progress we'd made. Community engagement in all 3 target regions is progressing ahead of schedule. We've established advisory boards in Portland, Seattle, and Spokane with representatives from local government, environmental groups, and business communities. More importantly, we've identified 3 potential local partners who could provide both operational support and community credibility for our expansion efforts. What kind of partnerships are we talking about? Joint ventures with established regional logistics companies. Instead of competing with local businesses, we'd be partnering with them, providing capital and expertise while they provide local relationships and market knowledge. Robert leaned forward, clearly interested despite himself. What would that look like in practical terms? Take the Portland market, for example. Northwest Distribution has been operating there for 15 years. They have established relationships with every major manufacturer in the region, but they lack the capital to expand their warehouse capacity. We provide the investment for expansion, they provide the local expertise and customer relationships. And how does that benefit us compared to building our own operation? Patricia asked, and I could hear the challenge in her voice. Lower startup costs, faster market entry, and immediate community acceptance, I replied. Instead of spending 18 months building relationships from scratch, we inherit 15 years of established trust. Victoria, who had been invited to observe the meeting, nodded approvingly. That's exactly the kind of strategic thinking that convinced us to invest in this project. The presentation continued for another 30 minutes, covering regulatory approvals, environmental partnerships, and timeline projections. By the end, even Patricia seemed grudgingly impressed with the progress we'd made. The numbers look good, Robert admitted as we wrapped up. Better than our original projections, actually. The community partnership approach is proving more effective than we anticipated, I agreed. When local stakeholders have genuine input into business decisions, they become invested in the venture's success. After the meeting, as the family members filed out of the boardroom, Victoria approached me with a satisfied smile. "Excellent presentation," she said. "Charles will be pleased with the progress report." "Thank you. I have to admit it's more rewarding work than I expected. Good strategic partnerships usually are." She paused, studying my face. "When we first met you at that dinner, we could see that you had something the rest of the family was missing. What was that?" Perspective. They'd been looking at expansion as a logistics challenge, when it was really a relationship challenge. She gathered her papers and headed toward the door. "Keep up the good work, Jessica. This project could be a model for how family businesses approach strategic growth." As I packed up my own materials, I reflected on how much had changed in just 6 months. I'd gone from being the invisible wife at family dinners to leading one of the company's most important strategic initiatives. More importantly, I'd discovered capabilities I didn't know I possessed and found work that genuinely excited me. But the real transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. Marcus and I had begun having conversations we'd never had before about our goals, our assumptions, our expectations for the future. Patricia, while still not exactly warm, had begun treating me as a legitimate family member rather than an inconvenient appendage. Robert had started asking for my input on strategic decisions beyond the expansion project. I was no longer the outsider looking in. I was Jessica Whitmore, Director of Strategic Partnerships, and I belonged at this table. That evening, as Marcus and I celebrated the successful board meeting with dinner at our favorite restaurant, he raised his glass in a toast. "To my brilliant wife, who taught me that the most important business skill is knowing when to listen." "To partnerships," I replied, clinking my glass against his. As we sat there in the candlelight, I thought about the question Victoria had asked at that first dinner. What distinguished Whitmore Industries from other companies looking to expand into the same market? The answer, it turned out, wasn't innovative logistics or competitive pricing or established relationships. It was the willingness to evolve, to embrace new perspectives, and to recognize that the strongest partnerships are built on mutual respect rather than traditional hierarchies. 6 months later, I stood in the conference room of our new Portland distribution center, watching through the windows as the first shipment rolled out to our partner companies. The facility was everything we'd envisioned: efficient, environmentally sustainable, and fully integrated with the local business community. Pretty impressive for someone who started out as just the daughter-in-law, a voice said behind me. I turned to find Patricia standing in the doorway, and for once, her expression held something that looked suspiciously like pride. I prefer Director of Strategic Partnerships, I replied with a smile. Yes, well, she stepped into the room, her usual commanding presence somehow softer than I remembered. I owe you an apology, Jessica. The words hung in the air between us, unexpected and strangely moving. You don't, I began. Yes, I do. She moved to stand beside me at the window, watching the organized chaos of our successful operation. I spent 3 years seeing you as a threat to our family's traditions instead of recognizing you as an asset to our family's future. It was perhaps the most honest thing Patricia had ever said to me. Change is difficult, I said softly, especially when you've built your identity around maintaining certain standards. Maintaining certain standards? She repeated with a rueful laugh. Is that what I was doing? I thought I was protecting my family's legacy, but I was actually limiting its potential. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two women who had finally found common ground after years of careful warfare. The Henderson Group called this morning. They want to discuss expanding our partnership model to other markets. Charles specifically requested that you lead the strategic planning process. Did he? I tried to keep the satisfaction out of my voice, but Patricia's knowing smile told me I hadn't quite succeeded. He did, and Robert wants to formally promote you to Vice President of Strategic Development. She paused, steadying my reflection in the window. It seems that betting against you was the worst business decision this family ever made. That evening, I found myself back in the same elegant dining room where this journey had begun, but everything was different now. The crystals still sparkled under the chandelier, the mahogany table still gleamed with generations of careful polishing, but the dynamics around it had fundamentally shifted. Marcus sat beside me, his hand resting comfortably on mine as we listened to Robert outline plans for expanding our partnership model to the southeast. Patricia contributed thoughtful questions about regulatory challenges and community engagement strategies. The Henderson Group representatives joined us via video conference, offering insights and asking pointed questions about implementation timelines. And I sat at the center of it all, no longer the outsider looking in desperate for acceptance, but a confident professional whose expertise was valued and whose opinions carried weight. The key question, Charles was saying from the screen, is whether we can replicate the Portland success in markets with different political and economic characteristics. The fundamental principles remain the same: community partnership, environmental responsibility, and genuine stakeholder involvement. The specific implementation will vary based on local conditions, but the strategic framework is scalable. Jessica's research into the Southeast regulatory environment has been particularly thorough, Robert added, and I caught the note of genuine respect in his voice. As the meeting concluded and we said our goodbyes to the Henderson team, Patricia lingered at the table while Marcus and Robert headed to the study to discuss operational details. I've been thinking about that first dinner, when you asked that question about environmental partnerships. What about it? I was furious at the time. Furious that you'd spoken up, furious that Charles and Victoria seemed so interested in your perspective, furious that you disrupted the careful script I'd prepared for the evening. I nodded, remembering the tension that had crackled around the table. But I realize now that you weren't disrupting anything. You were saving us from ourselves. Without your intervention, we would have lost the Henderson investment and probably several others after that. You might have found another way. No, her interruption was firm, but not unkind. We were so focused on impressing them with our established success that we couldn't see what they were actually looking for. Fresh thinking, innovative approaches, willingness to challenge conventional wisdom. She turned to look at me directly, her pale blue eyes serious and intent. The question you asked that night, it wasn't just about environmental partnerships. It was about whether we were brave enough to evolve, smart enough to listen, and confident enough to embrace change. She smiled, and for the first time in 3 years, it reached her eyes. Turns out we were. We just needed someone to show us how. 6 months later, I stood on the stage of the National Family Business Conference, delivering the keynote address to an audience of entrepreneurs, investors, and business leaders from across the country. The topic was strategic partnerships and sustainable growth, and I was speaking as the Vice President of Strategic Development for Whitmore Industries. In the audience, I could see Marcus beaming with pride, Robert taking notes like a diligent student, and Patricia watching with the satisfied expression of someone whose investment had paid off handsomely. The Henderson Group was represented as well, their presence a testament to the ongoing success of our partnership model. But the moment that meant the most to me came during the Q&A session, when a young woman in the back row raised her hand. My question is for Mrs. Whitmore. I'm about to marry into a family business, and I'm worried about how to contribute meaningfully when I don't have the same background or experience as the other family members. Do you have any advice? The question took me back to that terrifying dinner 6 years ago when I'd sat frozen with anxiety, desperate to prove my worth to people who couldn't see past their own assumptions. The most valuable contribution you can make, I said, looking directly at her, is to be authentically yourself. Don't try to become what you think they want you to be. Instead, focus on understanding what unique perspective and skills you bring to the table. I paused, thinking about the journey that had brought me to this stage. Family businesses often get trapped in their own echo chambers, reinforcing the same thinking patterns and approaches that made them successful in the past. But markets evolve, communities change, and what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. The young woman was nodding, and I could see recognition in her eyes. Your outsider perspective isn't a weakness to be overcome, it's an asset to be leveraged. You see things they can't see because they're too close to it. You ask questions they wouldn't think to ask because the answers seem obvious to them. But what if they don't want to hear those questions? She asked, and I heard my younger self in her voice. Then you ask them anyway, I replied firmly. Not to be confrontational, but because the health of the business depends on someone being willing to challenge assumptions and push for growth. After the conference, as we flew back home, Marcus reached across the airplane aisle to take my hand. That was incredible, he said. The way you connected with that young woman, the insights you shared about family business dynamics. I'm so proud of who you've become. Who I've become? I laughed softly. Marcus, I'm the same person I was 6 years ago. I just finally found a place where I could be that person openly. He considered this for a moment. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. It's not about changing who you are to fit into someone else's vision. It's about finding or creating spaces where you can be your authentic self. I squeezed his hand, thinking about the journey we'd taken together. Do you remember what you said that first night about not mentioning the community college thing? His face flushed with embarrassment. God, I can't believe I said that. I'm glad you did, I said, surprising him, because it forced me to confront the fact that I'd been hiding parts of myself, trying to be acceptable instead of trying to be valuable. And now, I looked out the airplane window at the landscape passing below us, thinking about the partnerships we'd built, the communities we'd served, the family dynamics we'd transformed. Now, I knew that the most powerful thing you can do in any relationship, business or personal, is to show up as exactly who you are and trust that the right people will recognize your value. As our plane descended toward home, I reflected on the unexpected path that had brought me here. 6 years ago, I'd been the nervous wife, dreading a family dinner, desperate for acceptance and terrified of saying the wrong thing. Today, I was a recognized expert in strategic business development, a sought-after speaker on family business dynamics, and most importantly, a full partner in both my marriage and my career. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been easy. It required courage to speak up when staying silent would have been safer. It demanded resilience to persist when the initial response was skeptical or dismissive. It took confidence to trust my own expertise even when others questioned it. But most of all, it required the willingness to stop apologizing for who I was and start celebrating what I could become. The dinner that started this journey was supposed to be about impressing investors and securing funding for a business expansion. Instead, It became a masterclass in the power of authentic contribution, the value of diverse perspectives, and the importance of creating space for everyone's voice to be heard. Patricia still hosted elegant dinner parties, but now they were collaborative strategy sessions where every participant was expected to contribute meaningfully. Robert still ran board meetings with military precision, but now they included robust debate and genuine consideration of alternative approaches. Marcus still worked hard to earn his father's approval, but now he also actively sought input from team members regardless of their position in the family hierarchy. And I no longer sat quietly at the end of the table, hoping not to embarrass anyone. I sat where I belonged, as an equal partner in both the conversation and the decisions that followed. The question that changed everything wasn't really about environmental partnerships or community engagement strategies. It was about whether I had the courage to trust my own voice, the confidence to share my own expertise, and the faith to believe that my perspective had value. The answer, as it turned out, was yes, and that made all the difference.
David, Rebecca whispered, horrified. I know how it sounds, Mom. I know how sick it is. But at the time, it felt like love, like I was protecting her, watching over her. I convinced myself that she needed me, that we had some kind of connection. He paused, taking several shaky breaths before continuing. The night I took her, she was walking home late from work. She had to close the coffee shop by herself, and it was dark. I had been watching from across the street, and when she started walking toward the parking garage, I followed her. Rebecca felt sick. This wasn't the David she knew, the thoughtful young man who had been raised to respect other people's boundaries and autonomy. But it was David speaking, David confessing to these horrible actions. I didn't plan to hurt her. I just wanted to talk to her, to explain how I felt. But when I approached her, she got scared. She started to scream, and I panicked. I grabbed her, put my hand over her mouth. There was a van parked nearby with the keys in it. I don't even know whose it was, and I put her in the van and drove to my apartment. You kidnapped her, Rebecca said. The words felt surreal in her mouth. Yes, David's voice was barely audible. Yes, I kidnapped her. I tied her up and kept her in my apartment for 10 days. I brought her food and water. I tried to talk to her, but she was terrified of me. She kept crying and begging me to let her go. So why didn't you? Rebecca asked. David, why didn't you just let her go when you realized how frightened she was? David looked at her with eyes that seemed decades older than his 25 years. Because I knew that as soon as I let her go, my life would be over. She would call the police, I would be arrested, and everything I had ever worked for would be gone. So I kept thinking I could fix it somehow, that I could make her understand that I wasn't a monster, that I really cared about her. But you were holding her prisoner. You were terrorizing an innocent woman. How did you think you could fix that? I don't know. David's voice cracked. I don't know what I was thinking. Every day I told myself I would let her go the next day, but then the next day would come and I still couldn't do it. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move forward with whatever I thought I was doing, but I couldn't go back either. Rebecca stared at her son, trying to reconcile this broken young man with the child she had raised. What happened in the woods, David? Why did you leave her there and disappear? On the last day, she begged me to let her go. She promised she wouldn't call the police, promised she would just disappear and never tell anyone what had happened. And I wanted to believe her, but I knew she was lying. I knew that the moment I untied her, she would run straight to the police. He paused, closing his eyes again. I realized I had to make a choice. I could kill her, or I could run. Those were my only options if I wanted to avoid prison. And Mom, I couldn't kill her. Despite everything I had done, I couldn't cross that line. So I left. I got in my car and drove north, thinking maybe I could disappear, start over somewhere new. But you didn't keep driving, Rebecca observed. You abandoned your car and went into the woods. I couldn't live with it, David said simply. I kept thinking about Sarah,
tied up in my apartment, waiting for me to come back. I kept thinking about you, wondering where I was, worried sick. I realized that I had destroyed everything good in my life, hurt innocent people, become someone I didn't recognize. So I left the car and walked into the woods thinking maybe I would just not come back out. Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. David, were you trying to kill yourself? I don't know. Maybe. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just walked and walked until I couldn't walk anymore, and then I lay down and waited to see what would happen. I thought it might be better for everyone if I just didn't exist anymore. They sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in their own thoughts. Rebecca struggled to process everything David had told her. This wasn't the son she knew, but it was still her son. Broken, lost, and facing a future that would likely be spent behind bars. David, I need you to know that I'm sorry. Not just for what I did to Sarah, but for what I've done to you. You raised me better than this. You taught me to be kind and respectful, and I threw all of that away. I became a monster, and I've destroyed your life along with mine. Rebecca reached out tentatively and took his hand. It felt cold and fragile, like a bird's wing. David, I don't understand how this happened. I keep going back through your childhood, through everything I thought I knew about you, and I can't find any signs that you were capable of this. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe I was too good at hiding who I really was, even from myself. Or maybe I just broke somewhere along the way, and neither of us noticed. Detective Walsh knocked on the doorframe, interrupting their conversation. Mrs. Martinez, I'm sorry, but we need to speak with your son now. You'll have to step outside. Rebecca squeezed David's hand one more time. I love you, she whispered. I don't understand what you did, and I can't forgive it, but you're still my son, and I love you. David's face crumpled. I love you too, Mom. I'm so sorry. Rebecca left the hospital in a daze. The conversation with David had answered some of her questions, but raised many more. How had she failed to see the warning signs? How had her quiet, respectful son developed into someone who could stalk and kidnap a young woman? What did this mean for her own future, her own sense of identity as a mother? Over the next few weeks, as David's case made its way through the legal system, Rebecca found herself living in a kind of limbo. She couldn't return to her normal life. The media attention had made that impossible, but she also couldn't move forward until she knew what would happen to David. She attended every court hearing, sitting in the back row and watching as her son was formally charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and stalking. Sarah Chen never appeared in court, but her victim impact statement was read by the prosecutor. In it, she described the 10 days of terror she had endured, not knowing if she would live or die, not understanding why she had been taken or what her captor wanted from her. The defendant stole more than just my freedom, the statement read. He stole my sense of safety in the world, my ability to trust strangers, my peace of mind. I will never be the same person I was before he decided that his obsession with me was more important than my right to live my life without fear. Rebecca wept as the statement was read, thinking about the bright young woman she had glimpsed for just a moment in David's apartment. Sarah Chen had done nothing wrong, had simply been living her life and working her job, and David had shattered that normalcy forever. David's lawyer, a tired-looking public defender named James Morrison, had advised him to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence. The prosecution was willing to recommend 20 years instead of life in prison if David would accept responsibility for his crimes and cooperate with their investigation. On the day David entered his plea, Rebecca sat in the courtroom and watched her son stand before the judge. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by the orange jumpsuit and the weight of what he had done. When the judge asked how he pleaded to the charges against him, David's voice was clear and steady. Guilty, Your Honor. The words seemed to echo in the courtroom, final and irreversible. Rebecca closed her eyes and felt something inside her break. Not the love for David, but the image of who he was, who she had thought she had raised him to be. After the hearing, she was approached by a woman she didn't recognize, a social worker who specialized in families of perpetrators of violent crimes.
Mrs. Martinez, I'm Linda Torres. I work with families who are dealing with situations like yours. I know this is an incredibly difficult time, and I want you to know that there are resources available to help you process what's happened. Rebecca looked at Linda Torres with exhaustion. I don't even know what I'm supposed to feel. Am I supposed to hate my son for what he did? Am I supposed to forgive him? Am I supposed to feel guilty that I somehow failed as a mother? You're supposed to feel whatever you feel, Linda said gently. There's no right or wrong way to react when someone you love commits a serious crime. But I can tell you that isolation and shame don't help anyone. You might benefit from speaking with other parents who have been through similar experiences. Rebecca wasn't sure she wanted to meet other parents whose children had done terrible things. She wasn't sure she wanted to be part of that particular club. But as the weeks passed and her isolation deepened, she began to consider Linda's suggestion. The support group met in the basement of a community center across town. When Rebecca arrived for her first meeting, she found 8 other people sitting in folding chairs arranged in a circle. They were mostly women, mostly middle-aged, and they all had the same haunted look that Rebecca had seen in her own mirror lately. Linda Torres facilitated the group, and she began each session the same way. This is a safe space for people whose loved ones have committed serious crimes. We don't judge here, and we don't minimize what our family members have done. We're here to support each other through the aftermath. Rebecca listened as the other group members shared their stories. There was Margaret, whose son had been convicted of armed robbery. There was Robert, whose daughter had killed someone while driving drunk. There was Patricia, whose husband had been arrested for child pornography. Each story was different, but the aftermath was remarkably similar. The shock, the media attention, the loss of friends and community support, the struggle to reconcile love for their family member with horror at what that person had done. I keep thinking I should have seen it coming. I keep going back through our marriage looking for signs that my husband was what he was. But I can't find them. Either he was incredibly good at hiding it, or I was incredibly blind. Maybe both, said Margaret. Maybe we see what we want to see in the people we love. Rebecca found herself nodding. She thought about all the times David had deflected her questions about his social life, all the times she had accepted his explanations without digging deeper. She had wanted to believe that her son was exactly who he appeared to be, quiet, studious, respectful, because that made her life easier and her role as his mother more successful. But what if she had asked more questions? What if she had been more involved in his adult life, more aware of his struggles with loneliness and social isolation? Would that have made a difference? Or would David have found a way to hide his growing obsession regardless? The hardest part, Robert said during one meeting, is that I still love my daughter. I know what she did was wrong. I know someone died because of her choices, but she's still my child. I still want to protect her, even though she doesn't deserve protection. Rebecca understood that feeling completely. Even knowing what David had done to Sarah Chen, even understanding the trauma he had caused, she still felt a maternal urge to defend him, to explain his actions, to find some way to minimize his responsibility. It was a shameful feeling, but it was real. As the months passed, Rebecca began to build a new kind of life. She moved to a different town, where the media attention had died down, and people didn't immediately recognize her as the kidnapper's mother. She found a job at a library, working quietly among books, and helping patrons with their research requests. It was peaceful work that didn't require her to explain herself or her past. She visited David in prison once a month. The conversations were stilted and painful, both of them struggling to find a way to relate to each other in this new reality. David was participating in therapy and educational programs, trying to understand how he had become capable of such violence. He sent Rebecca letters between visits, filled with apologies and attempts at self-analysis that broke her heart. I think I was angry, he wrote in one letter, not at Sarah specifically, but at the world.
at my loneliness, at the fact that I couldn't seem to connect with people the way other people did. I convinced myself that she was the answer to all my problems, that if I could just make her understand how much I cared about her, everything would be perfect. I see now how delusional that was, but at the time, it felt completely rational. Rebecca kept all of David's letters in a shoebox in her closet, though she wasn't sure why. They were painful reminders of everything that had gone wrong, but they were also the only way she had to track her son's progress toward understanding and redemption. 2 years after David's arrest, Rebecca received an unexpected phone call. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, but when she answered, she heard a young woman's voice. "Mrs. Martinez? This is Sarah Chen." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. She had thought about Sarah constantly over the past 2 years, had wondered how she was healing from her trauma, had wanted desperately to reach out, but had been advised against it by everyone from Detective Walsh to Linda Torres. "Sarah," Rebecca said, unsure of what else to say. How are you?" "I'm okay," Sarah said, though her voice carried a weight that suggested the answer was more complicated than that. "I'm calling because I wanted to talk to you. I know this might seem strange, but I've been working with a therapist on my recovery, and she suggested that it might help me to speak with you." "Of course," Rebecca said immediately. "Whatever you need. I can't begin to tell you how sorry I am for what my son did to you. That's actually what I wanted to talk about. Mrs. Martinez, I need you to know that what David did to me wasn't your fault. I've read some of the media coverage, and I know that people have blamed you, have suggested that you should have seen the signs or done something to prevent it. But I want you to know that I don't blame you." Rebecca felt tears spring into her eyes. "Sarah, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Sarah interrupted gently. "Because carrying around anger and blame has been poisoning me for 2 years. I'm not ready to forgive your son. I may never be ready for that. But I can forgive you, because you didn't do anything wrong. You loved your child and tried to raise him well. You couldn't have known what he was capable of." They talked for an hour, and by the end of the conversation, Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the guilt and shame that had been crushing her for 2 years. Sarah's forgiveness didn't erase what had happened, didn't make David's actions any less terrible, but it gave Rebecca permission to stop blaming herself for failing to prevent the unpreventable. "I want you to know that I'm doing well. I finished my degree, I'm working at a nonprofit that helps other crime victims, and I'm in a relationship with someone who makes me feel safe and loved. Your son took 10 days of my life, but he didn't take my future. I wanted you to know that." After the call ended, Rebecca sat in her small apartment, feeling something she hadn't experienced in 2 years, a sense of peace. Not happiness, exactly, and certainly not forgiveness for what David had done, but a kind of acceptance that allowed her to breathe freely for the first time since that terrible day when she had found Sarah under David's bed. She thought about the support group, about the other parents who were struggling to rebuild their lives after their children's crimes. She thought about David in his prison cell, working to understand and atone for what he had done. She thought about Sarah, building a new life from the pieces that David had shattered. None of them would ever be the same people they had been before that dark chapter began. David would spend the next 18 years in prison paying for his crimes. Sarah would carry the trauma of those 10 days for the rest of her life. And Rebecca would always be the mother of a man who had done something unforgivable. But they were all still alive. They were all still trying to find meaning and purpose in the aftermath of tragedy. And perhaps that was enough. Not redemption, exactly, but the possibility of moving forward, of building something new from the ruins of what had been lost. Rebecca looked at the framed photo on her mantle, not the graduation picture she had once displayed, but a newer photo of herself with her support group friends. They were an unlikely family, bound together not by blood, but by shared trauma and the determination to survive it. In the photo, they were smiling, Not the bright, uncomplicated smiles of people who had never known real pain, but the quieter, deeper smiles of people who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to keep walking toward whatever light they could find. It wasn't the life Rebecca had imagined for herself. It wasn't the future she had planned when she had held baby David in her arms 25 years ago, full of hope and dreams for who he might become. But it was her life now, and she was learning to live it with something approaching grace. The silence under the bed had changed everything. It had revealed truths that couldn't be unknown, had shattered illusions that couldn't be rebuilt. But it had also led to unexpected connections, hard-won wisdom, and the kind of strength that only comes from surviving the unthinkable. Rebecca Martinez was no longer just a mother. She was a survivor, a member of a community of people who understood loss in its deepest form, and a woman who had learned that love and horror could coexist in the same heart without destroying it. As she prepared for her monthly visit to see David, Rebecca felt the familiar weight of grief and disappointment settle on her shoulders. But alongside it was something new, the knowledge that she would survive this visit as she had survived all the others, and that tomorrow she would wake up and continue the difficult work of building a meaningful life from the pieces that remained. The story would never have a happy ending, but it would have an ending she could live with, and in the aftermath of such devastation, that was more than she had ever dared to hope for.